Hi, and welcome to Ethnographic Imagination Basel, a series on reimagining the world from the mundane. My name is George Palmeyu, and in this episode we will talk about extractivism, a global market premised on the extraction of natural resources and raw materials. Our guest is Mark Goodale, whose work explores lithium extraction, new global green economies, and the long histories of extractivism in South America. So stay with us for a conversation on how the unpredictability of extractive economies open and foreclose various futures. Mark Goodale is professor of cultural and social anthropology at University of Lausanne. His research explores law, human rights, politics, ideology, and morality through long-term ethnographic research in Bolivia. His projects have respectively explored Bolivian government, justice, and recognition under Evo Morales, human rights activism, as well as most recently, extractivist economies. Mark is author of numerous books such as Dilemmas of Modernity, Bolivian Encounters with Law and Liberalism, published in 2008, Surrendering to Utopia, An Anthropology of Human Rights, published in 2009, Anthropology and Law, A Critical Introduction, published in 2017, A Revolution in Fragments, Traversing Scales of Justice, Ideology and Practice in Bolivia, published in 2019, and Reinventing Human Rights, published in 2022. Our conversation today will focus on his most recent book, Extracting the Future, Lithium in an Era of Energy Transition, published in 2025 by the University of California Press. Mark, thank you for accepting our invite. We are happy to have you on our podcast.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here. I look forward to the conversation.
Let us start with the question of a definition here, extractivism, and maybe relatedly, extractive economies. What do we mean by these terms, and how does an anthropological take on them look like? What does it have to offer?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, when we talk about extractivism, extractivist economies, in a way, we're talking about the rise of capitalism, the rise of modern economics, the connection of the global world, which goes back hundreds of years. And even though capitalism has different faces today, there's digital capitalism, there's surveillance capitalism, and other forms. The form of capitalism which depends on the extraction of raw materials, typically from places in which those raw materials are found, and the incorporation of those zones of extraction by global powers, that remains the working definition of extractivism. So extractivism, the ism part of it, is a political economy. It's an entire economy organized around the extraction of raw materials and their circulation within these global markets. And that, as I said, that is coextensive with the rise of capitalism itself, but it's not all of capitalism. But it remains, as my book shows and as others have shown, it remains a sort of important and we might say violent face of capitalism.
So you're pointing to two things, and you're arguing also for these explicitly in the book. It's on the one hand the mode of production, the actual extraction of natural resources, but also then the geopolitics, the system that then assigns value in the circulation of these raw materials. What do anthropologists do with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the anthropologists who are working, including myself, who are working on extractivism and extractivist economies, I think we're doing work that combines sort of an intensely local focus on the extraction itself, the impacts of extraction from local communities, the impact on the environment, which is obviously really important. But given what I just said about the relationship between extractivism and global capitalism, it means that our anthropology also has to be attuned to those global circulations. So it's it's an anthropology that has to navigate between that very local ethnographic encounter with extractivism and all of its facets, and its relationship to the broader political economy, as you mentioned, which justifies, which makes sense of those local impacts.
Working across these scales. Then,
exactly.
As it were. So at the forefront of your new book is lithium, a light, highly reactive alkaline metal used in the making of rechargeable batteries and now electric vehicles. How did you come upon it? And how do the economies that emerge around it look like?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, this is a really good question, because as I write about in the book, in a kind of reflective section in the introduction, I didn't think very much about lithium until I came to this project. As you mentioned, most of my work, my research in Bolivia and elsewhere, has been associated with law, with human rights, with political movements, with indigenous movements, and so on. It just so happens that I am, and have been for many years, a specialist in the anthropology of Bolivia, which happens to have the world's largest reserves of lithium by a large margin, upwards of around 40% of the world's known lithium. At the same time that Bolivia hasn't begun to really extract at an industrial level lithium. So in 2019, when I finished with the project you mentioned, which led to the book A Revolution in Fragments, which was a study of law and politics, this global rush for lithium was just picking up steam. And so as someone who was interested in knew about Bolivia and saw that this was going to be a really important dynamic in Bolivia, I turned my attention to it. But honestly, over the 4 years in which I was doing research, I had to learn a lot about it. I mean, I don't have a background in chemistry and chemical engineering and geology, but as we do as anthropologists, we have to learn enough to be able to ask questions about those things. And so I came to learn a lot about lithium. At some point, I was dreaming about lithium. I had lithium on the brain. Which is a kind of somewhat of a pun, since lithium is also used to treat bipolar disorder. But lithium became really the central focus of the book, and I think as one of the reviewers, one of the people who did an advanced review of the book mentioned, the book traces the materiality of lithium through its different iterations. Including as the ingredient for lithium rechargeable batteries, and as one of the latest in a long line, as I'm sure we'll talk about, raw materials that Bolivia has extracted as part of this global process.
So I want to eventually come to this question of how something like lithium becomes suddenly an object of desire, of fantasy, seductive in certain ways, promissory in others. But before we do so, you also do a lot of work of decentering the object, as it were. You show that this is not the first raw material that was at the center of extractive economies in Bolivia. There was silver, palm oil, broccoli, mushrooms, many other things. What do we learn from this kind of decentering act and say, well, there is something here that's perhaps not new?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was a process in that part of the book, and I call it, genealogies of extractivist entanglement. So what I do, and what besides sort of doing a really relatively short history of lithium and tracing it up through, as you mentioned, up through its use in rechargeable batteries, I also do another kind of genealogy with different raw materials in Bolivian history. And Bolivia has been an icon of extractivist entanglement going back to the colonial period. Some of your listeners might know the work of the Uruguayan essayist Eduardo Galeano, his book 100 The Open Veins of Latin America. And in this book, The Open Veins of Latin America, which was written in the late 1960s, he is doing a history of Latin America's entanglement with these global extractivist economies, the rise of capitals, the rise of the modern world in a way, and the open veins that he starts his book with are the open mines of Potosi, Bolivia, which were silver in the colonial period. So Bolivia has, and the mining and the extraction of raw materials is an icon for the kind of exploitation, the kind of environmental and geopolitical violence which is associated with. So I trace this genealogy from silver to, you didn't mention, but also in the late 19th century to guano, which was basically bird shit, which was used to make nitrate for fertilizer, but more importantly, dynamite. And that was at the center of a major conflict in Bolivia. And then we had rubber, and then we had tin, and we've had gas, and now lithium. And what I argue and what I show, ethno-historically, let's say, is that with each of those raw materials, they were wrapped up in a promise of a transformative future. So every single one of those, guano, which made colonialism, the dynamite that was made with guano, Bolivian and Peruvian guano, made the colonial project possible. Silver, the Spanish colonial government in the 15th and 16th centuries funded their entire colonial empire for almost 300 years from the silver they extracted from one mine in Bolivia. Of course, when oil was discovered, that was wrapped around another set of imaginaries. And lithium, in that sense, despite all of the rhetoric about the newness, the uniqueness of the green transition, has to be situated in this longer genealogy in which each of these raw materials is associated with the promise of a better future, which justifies their extraction beyond their economic consequences.
Yeah. And then what emerges around it, so it's a promissory sort of utopia or of something yet to come that is more than material itself. But then what emerges around it and what you call, in this case, a lithium energy assemblage, the kinds of institutional, technological, ideological dimensions associated with extraction. What do those look like in the case of lithium?
Yeah, so the lithium energy assemblage was, as we mentioned, what do anthropologists bring to extractivism? When you move from the local material level to these levels of the scales of, let's say, of global circulation, what kind of theoretical framework, what kind of approaches do we take? So it took me a while to choose a metaphor, to think about a framework. Because in the area of lithium, some of the dominant metaphors are based on questions of tight connection, linearity. For example, the value chain. If you imagine a chain, which is a metaphor in which the links are tightly connected and one is able to trace from one side of the chain to the other, right? That's very common in the area of raw material circulation, including lithium. And what I was finding with my ethnography was something much messier. It was difficult to trace those links from the planned extraction in the Salar de Uyuni, the world's largest salar, to, for example, national policy and eventually the production of batteries and electric vehicles. And so I sort of drew from the Deleuze and Guattari notion of the assemblage, which imagines nodes of interconnection, but in a much messier, sort of incomplete fashion. And I actually went back to the book and saw that there were these images that a Canadian Guyanese illustrator called Mark Goodale had developed to try to illustrate what an assemblage looks like. And I wrote him and got permission to use it, and that's what appears in one of the illustrations that appears in the introduction, where you see these different nodes, some of which are giving rise to other nodes and other connections, but some of which sort of go off into dead ends. This rhizomatic idea of interconnection, I found very helpful. So that to me captured what I was seeing from throughout the multiple scales in which lithium, the Bolivian lithium project sort of is intelligible, which includes, for example, which included companies in Germany who were involved, a company in Austin, Texas that I did research with, and the way in which they were sort of loosely connected. The assemblage, for me, captured that better than any other metaphor I could think of.
So an assemblage of different nodes of intensities that is not linear, but that can take you in different directions. How does then one do research? We would say, I remember being in graduate school, we were being asked, what is your anthropological village that you actually study? Where is your village to do the project? And an assemblage of this sort takes you in different kind. I mean, you're talking to people about their cars, you're talking to factory owners, you're talking to people involved in the politics of all this. How do you plan a research around something that is, at least at first sight, quite obscure?
Yeah. I mean, I think that was, so I was as all anthropologists do, I was turning to some of the methodological models that were out there, the multi-sided ethnography, for example, that George Marcus and others innovated. And for me, the multi-sided, I wanted to get away from the notion of the site. And Sally Mary, my dear colleague who passed away a few years ago, she also grappled with this in a book in which she was tracing the global network, the global, I would call it an assemblage, of actors that are part of the human rights movement, women's rights movement. And so she settles on what she calls a deterritorialized ethnography, which I also found very interesting. And then I was looking at work that on scales and on multi-scalar ethnography, and I found that led me eventually to the assemblage. But honestly, to answer your question, it really was a process of finding these nodes, identifying these nodes, which had some connection, however loose, with what was going on in the Lithium project in Bolivia, and then in a way, kind of ex post facto, reconstructing the assemblage, after the project was more or less completed. It was sort of thinking about how do these different actors connect with each other. So it was a very sort of non-linear, I wouldn't say achronological, but it was sort of moving between different time periods and different scales in a way that led to the final product, let's say.
And discovering new nods as you go.
Exactly. And realizing that my project was only ethnographically, because ultimately we have to observe, we have to interview, we have to have an encounter, an ethnographic encounter, no matter how sort of innovative that is, knowing that I was leaving aside, missing intentionally in a way, many of the nodes that were part of this particular assemblage.
A key paradox that is at the core of your book, as I read it, is and drives the whole argument, is that between, on the one hand, what is now a global desire for green, that is environmentally friendly consumption, driving a demand for electric vehicles, and on the other hand, the fact that this is premised on an extractive economy, lithium, with all its more problematic implications.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to, maybe for our audience, bring out some examples that emerge, or some unexpected ethnographic sort of moments that emerge out of this paradox, out of this seeming contradiction.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, the first thing to say about that is, I'm not, a lot of people who are doing the anthropology of extractivism or the green transition, that's not really an innovative argument to say that there's a paradox at the heart of the green transition, that it's dependent upon the kind of extraction that I document. I think one of the things I want to do in my book, more than say other environmental researchers who are not sort of ethnographically grounded, is to really give a portrait of the complexity that emerges from that paradox. What does that paradox look like ethnographically? So, it's not a simple story of violent extraction taking place in Bolivia and sort of disconnected activists and others and or policymakers. Because as I show, and this is to answer your question, even at the so-called local level or local scales in Bolivia, you have a real heterogeneous set of actors. People who are, say, entrepreneurs, which is interesting and contradictory in the case of Bolivia, in the context of a socialist government in which you have a state-run, state-driven process of not just lithium extraction, but really economic development. But yet you have these sort of entrepreneurs who are inspired by people like Elon Musk and others, who are there in places like Cochabamba. You have one of my chapters documents the first electric vehicle company in Latin America, which happens to be in Cochabamba in Bolivia. So I think it's the surprising complexity of the paradox that I would emphasize. You have people even in indigenous villages, and again, from a kind of much higher scale, the assumption is that, and you see this, for example, in Chile and other places in which lithium is much more well advanced, you have this pretty stark contrast between villages, some peasant or indigenous villages, whose water is being used for lithium extraction, who don't gain from the benefits of this national and eventually international project, just like they haven't for many years. But in Bolivia, as I show, you have a much more complicated situation of you have indigenous movements who criticize the government for not extracting fast enough, for not moving the project along faster than they were. So I think that would be some of the surprising things that I found is the complexity within the paradox. The paradox remains there, depending on which level we want to look at it. But again, that's the genius. I think that's what we offer as ethnographers, is to sort of unpeel the layers of, in this case, this green energy paradox to show how complicated it is. It doesn't lend itself to policymaking. It doesn't lend itself to sort of macro movements. But I think that's one of the things we have to offer.
If we were to dwell then on precisely that, you mentioned the small electric vehicle produced in Cochabamba in Bolivia, and you write quite beautifully about the kind of imaginaries of the future that get invested into this seemingly small object. But indeed, that also resonates with lithium more generally, national visions of futurity that come to be tied to this raw material. And since the future is in the title of the book, so extracting the future, I wanted to think a little bit about time, temporality with you. How does the future figure in extractive economies, and what are the implications of the rush, economic rush, political rush, social rush of a hope for a better tomorrow that come to be at different times associated with something like lithium?
I mean, I think that the thing with lithium and its connection with the energy transition, I think one of the things that makes it perhaps somewhat different than other raw materials is that this lithium rush is being undertaken in the context of a kind of global moral environmental panic around global heating and around climate change. So there's this futurity is bound up in a kind of urgency to respond as quickly as possible to the crisis of global heating, or to slow it down in some way in order to ameliorate some of the worst consequences of these processes. So that's, I think, one of the things that complicates a futurity here, which you could see map on to other kinds of futurities which are related to other raw materials. This is part of this broader panic, let's say. So the challenge in Bolivia for Bolivian policymakers, who everybody knows, I mean, the discourse is we're sitting on this white gold, the world's largest reserves of lithium. Prices are spiking. All prices have moderated recently, but when I was doing the research, the prices were up enormously. So they had this idea that we were going to transform our economy, but also be part of the solution to a problem that we ourselves didn't create. This is very true of other countries. I have colleagues who work, let's say, in countries like Ghana and Africa on their own similar stories of extracting materials and pushing for extraction, despite the fact that there are environmental consequences, as a kind of decolonial move to say, look, we deserve to be part of this process as well. We've got the raw materials. We deserve to benefit from it. So that discourse was very similar in Bolivia, that we were going to benefit economically, but we were also going to solve a problem, climate change, that we ourselves, like most countries in the global south, played no role in creating. So I think that futurity, that sense of time is unique, is somewhat unique here. And the second part of the time question, I would say, is this is a story of potentiality. And there's a kind of small literature around resource extraction, other cases in which countries have mobilized, sometimes as the case in Bolivia, for decades, to plan for the extraction of a valued raw material that didn't actually come to pass.
Didn't happen, yeah.
And so I think here, at least during the period of the research, it was a story of potentiality, which I think shapes the way in which the future is understood when it remains this abstract possibility, a tantalizing abstract utopian possibility that changes the way the future is understood compared to, for example, just across the border in Chile, which has a lithium industry that's 40 years old, and everybody knows what lithium extraction looks like environmentally at the local level and what its consequences are for local communities. So I think that's another dimension to the question about the future.
But I wonder here, you see, when certain kind of extractive economies promises don't realize. But then there is also the question of who do they realize their promises for? And the other rush, the other acceleration one imagines around such a promise is, do I put myself in the right path at the right time to also benefit from something that would happen in my area? And what you suggest, it seems that, well, there is that in the extractive economies more generally, but now with global climate change and so on, there is this extra thing that intensifies perhaps the rush for the future.
And I think, we're in this very interesting moment, because we're in this moment in which, of course, politically, you have regimes across the planet, including from the United States across the board to Russia, which are, and in the case of the United States, which are moving against the climate policies of the Biden administration, and you see prices for lithium coming down, which is a reflection of softening demand. The Chinese are still moving forward with their goal to monopolize the global electric vehicle market, and that's moving forward. So the question I would have, and this is just going to be something to answer, is, we've blown past the Paris targets to keep the global heating at a certain level. And I wonder at what point in which the discourse about climate change and the urgency will start itself to soften. In other words, in which we have a recognition by, say, the international climate scientists that, for example, it's not going to be possible to really ameliorate as we wanted to global heating, because the political and economic and other processes just are not moving in that direction, which will then sort of open the door for another kind of futurity, one which I mentioned also in the end of my book, a kind of, and other people have written about the ruins of capitalism and making meaning amidst at more reduced scales, more localized level, more regional levels, finding solidarity in smaller scales, and in a way not giving up on the planet, but sort of letting go of, say, global heating or global warming as the primary vector, the primary motivating factor for our policies. And I think that's going to be something to follow over the coming years, maybe decades. I won't be doing that, but someone else will. Others will. Maybe you will. But my book sort of captures that moment just before. Right. While the planetary urgency is still driving our understandings of the future.
And yet, for a long time, we could have talked about the afterlives of various kinds of extractive economies, and people making lives in the rubble, making lives in the debris. And perhaps, what I find interesting in your argument is precisely this alternative politics of local, putting things together at a different scale that has a certain new potentiality. Maybe just to end on that note, how do we do an ethnography in what might probably, for better or worse, let's say, be called the remains of futures past? Although perhaps we don't want to reproduce that negativity to it.
I think here, anthropology also offers, I think, a not exactly unique window, but I think an important window. To the extent to which we're engaged ethnographically with people, with community, with people's lives, with their lived experiences, I think we're always going to capture people in the process of making meaning, finding joy, even amidst these broader, say, planetary crises. So I think that in the end, if we let go of the broader global scale, which leads us down to more pessimistic kind of analyses, I think if we hold on to our ethnographic sensibility, hold on to our intimate engagement with people, with places, processes, local histories, and others, I think what we'll do is we'll continue to contribute to a kind of positive alternative narrative about what's happening now will happen in the future. Anna Singh talks about finding meaning amidst the ruins of capitalism, and her most recent element was a mushroom and not lithium. But I try to do something similar to that. I try to, in focusing on narratives, people who are making their own histories at local levels, I think that we'll be able to sort of contribute to an alternative understanding of the future.
So identifying activating and amplifying potentialities that lie otherwise in the mundane, in the seeming trivial, at least from the point of view of
which is
scale.
where we all live ultimately.
Yeah. Mark, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Thank you for the ideas you gave us. And for those of you in the audience who actually want to learn more about this, I encourage you to pick up Extracting the Future and read more about this. Thank you for being.
Thank you very much.